Hello, and welcome to Daily Book Listening. The book we're sharing today is called Asking the Right Questions, with the subtitle, A Guide to Critical Thinking. There are two authors, M. Neil Brown and Stuart M. Keeley from the United States. M. Neil Brown is an economics professor who has written many books and articles. He places a special emphasis on critical thinking and is a keynote speaker at the International Conference on Critical Thinking, continually contributing to its promotion and development. According to his latest bio, he provides critical thinking training and consulting services for organizations such as the U.S. Department of National Security, Russia's State Secret Service, as well as IBM Asia Pacific, the Lego Group, the Association to Advance Collegiate Schools of Business, WCSB, and the United States Air Force Academy. So, he is a highly professional provider of critical thinking training and consulting. What I find rather strange is, how does he train both Americans and Russians? Well, that's not our main topic. The other author, Stuart M. Keeley, is a psychology professor at Bowling Green State University. This book can be called a Bible in the field of critical thinking. It's now in its 10th edition, a classic that has remained a bestseller for over 30 years. This book is about a very practical thinking skill, critical thinking. What is critical thinking? Some people might not have heard of it and may be curious about what it's for. Think about whether you've encountered scenarios like this in life. For the same issue, different experts may hold different, or even completely opposite, opinions. For example, some experts believe that after a certain event, housing prices will surely soar, while other experts believe they will surely plummet. Some people think traditional Chinese medicine is very effective, while others believe it's a scam with no scientific basis. We can see that for the same issue, the world often lacks a universally accepted standard. It's not like 1 + 1 = 2, which can be a universal standard. The right and wrong of many issues are very difficult to discern. So, who should we believe? And how should we make our own choices? What kind of opinions should we listen to? This is what critical thinking aims to teach us. But in fact, mastering any way of thinking or tool is not easy, because it requires changing your past habits and ways of thinking. And changing an established trajectory is particularly difficult. Therefore, critical thinking requires a great deal of training, practice, and reflective exploration to master. I also have many friends around me who find learning critical thinking difficult. They feel that life goes on the same whether they learn it or not, that only highly rational people need to learn this, and they'd rather live a bit more relaxed. So, is critical thinking really an optional way of thinking, or an add-on tool that only rational people need? If critical thinking is a skill, what are the key principles, breakthroughs, or points of caution in mastering it? These are the 3 topics I want to share with you today. First, why should everyone learn critical thinking? Second, what is the most important technique in the method of learning critical thinking? Third, what is a significant pitfall to be aware of when learning critical thinking? First, let's look at why everyone needs to learn critical thinking. The education we received from a young age was to study hard and make progress every day. The way of learning was roughly like this. Carefully read every sentence in the book. Remember more information, then underline keywords and key sentences. Take notes in a notebook on the book's main content, viewpoints, and methods. And then repeatedly check the notes and mind maps to make sure we haven't missed anything important. Our task was to find, remember, and understand the author's meaning and learn the methods the author taught us. Isn't this what most good students do? But it's a very scary thing if we continue to do this all the time. Why? Because we only remember the author's methods, viewpoints, and reasoning, but we have no way to evaluate them. Imagine if you were an emperor or a president with all sorts of experts and advisors providing you with information and intelligence. You certainly wouldn't need to spend time reading books and taking notes. Or would that mean you wouldn't encounter problems? No. The 29th president in American history was named Warren G. Harding. When he took office, he faced a very vexing problem. He loudly questioned, "This expert tells me to do this, and another expert tells me to do that. You tell me, what on earth am I supposed to do?" Even if you are the president, with countless think tanks and experts giving you advice, you still have to face a problem: how to choose among these different and even conflicting opinions. If you lack the ability to think independently and critically analyze others' viewpoints and arguments, then even as president, you cannot properly fulfill your duties. As ordinary people without so many expert advisors to serve us, making these decisions can be even more difficult. Therefore, to change this predicament, what we need to do is to learn and master critical thinking. What is critical thinking? I think there's a good saying. Critical thinking is thinking about our thinking process. Why do we need to think about our thinking process? Because people have all sorts of flaws and irrationalities in their thinking. There are two types of thinking we need to deal with. One is others' opinions, which are the results of their thinking, and the other is the opinions and conclusions we come up with ourselves. It's easy to understand why we need to rethink others' opinions, as they might have their own interests and motives intertwined. So we must be alert to whether there are unreasonable motives behind others' opinions. As for rethinking our own thoughts, although we are not driven by interests or motives, there are still major flaws in our thinking. Such flaws exist not only in others, but also in ourselves. It's just that when we make decisions, we often assume that the decisions we make are the right ones, when in fact they may carry very significant risks. Imagine two candidates are running for president. The first candidate says, "The team I organized has achieved great results in protecting women's rights. First, our leadership is highly committed and takes concrete action. We work overtime to serve the public. Second, we have built a comprehensive system and framework. Third, we have strengthened support measures and funding for our services, blah, blah, blah." That's the first candidate. The second candidate comes up and says, "Our team has achieved great results in protecting women's rights. In fact, one of the beneficiaries is right here in the audience. She is Alice, 70 years old, from a certain small town. She is with us today, and under our new job promotion plan for the elderly, she currently holds a full-time job at a hospital. Alice, would you please stand up?" After hearing these two different candidates, who would you be more willing to vote for? I think most of us would choose the latter. Because the case presented by the latter is vivid and detailed, thus attracting more attention and evoking more emotional resonance. This is even a core part of the various public speaking methods and techniques we learn, details and anecdotes. But did you know that this kind of argumentation is not helpful for you to make a correct decision? Because moving stories and anecdotes cannot serve as evidence. Once they are used as evidence, they should be highly scrutinized. They can only indicate a possibility, but they cannot prove effectiveness. But if you don't know this, if you don't have the methods of critical thinking, after listening to this presidential speech, you will believe you have chosen a better president with your own independent will. What terrifying is that? Similar flaws occur in choosing a house, choosing a job, deciding whether to cooperate with someone, whether to sign a contract, and so on, thus affecting all aspects of life. Do you still dare to say that critical thinking has nothing to do with you and is just a topic for rational people? No, it is related to the vital interests of every single person. So let's move on to the second topic we're discussing today. How can one learn or master critical thinking? In fact, the method for learning critical thinking is reflected in the title of this book, Learn to Ask Questions. What questions to ask? Why ask questions? In reality, whether we accept a viewpoint, agree with someone's opinion, or listen to an expert's advice depends on whether we believe their argument. The so-called argument consists of two parts. One is the conclusion I want to tell you, and the other is the reasons supporting this conclusion. That is, an argument is composed of a conclusion and reasons. For example, someone tells you, "Please do not smoke. Smoking is harmful to your health." In this argument, the conclusion is, "Do not smoke." And the supporting reason is, "Smoking is harmful to your health." Let's think about how critical thinking questions the conclusion and evidence. First, ask the first question. Is the conclusion reasonable? Is "do not smoke" a prohibition for everyone? If a person is terminally ill and doesn't care about their health, can they smoke if they want to? What if this place is very poor, has no other industries, and if they don't produce cigarettes, the local people will be displaced in large numbers? First, you need to think about the conclusion. Second, you need to think about its evidence. Harmful to health? What evidence do you have to prove it's really harmful? What is the intensity of the harm, and what counts as harmful? Does just a cough count as harm, or does it have to kill me instantly to be considered harmful? The evidence should clarify these points. So from this example, we can see that the training of critical thinking is actually about understanding whether the other party's argument is reasonable by continuously asking questions. To make our thinking rigorous and to consider all aspects in an argument, we need to ask a variety of questions. For example, what is its conclusion? What is the issue being discussed? What are its reasons? Which words or phrases are ambiguous? Are there fallacies in the reasoning? How credible is the evidence provided? Are the statistics used deceptive? Is this conclusion really reasonable? And so on. These kinds of questions are all things we need to ask and think about after hearing an argument. You might say, wow, that's so many questions to ask. I might not be able to think of them all when I'm practicing. How to solve this problem? Those who have listened to the Checklist Manifesto before will know. The Checklist Manifesto proposed a solution. When we already know how to do something but are prone to omissions, mistakes, or forgetting during execution, we use a checklist to ensure quality. So, the solution in the book, Asking the Right Questions, is the same. It provides a checklist of 11 questions. Every time you encounter an argument, you go through the questions on this checklist one by one to ask and think, so as to ensure that nothing is missed in your learning of critical thinking. The essence of critical thinking is to constantly ask questions, inquiring whether the entire argument is reasonable. Do you feel that critical thinking sounds quite simple? Just find a conclusion for an issue, check if its evidence is reasonable, and slowly you can master critical thinking? Doing so is certainly helpful, but it can lead you into an even bigger potential flaw and misconception. This is the third topic we want to talk about, an important pitfall to be aware of in the process of learning critical thinking, which is to ignore that what is unseen is more important than what is seen. What does what is unseen is more important than what is seen mean? It means that in an argument, there are parts that the author has stated and parts that the author has not. And what truly affects our ability to make a reasonable judgment is often the unseen part. This is like being a high-level leader going for an inspection. If you only see the scenes that others have carefully arranged and decorated and make decisions based on that, you could be taking a huge risk. Similarly, if we decide whether to accept someone's viewpoint based solely on the argument they have written down, we are also at great risk. So what is that unseen part? What information might the author have hidden or omitted? There are 3 types of information that are most easily overlooked and forgotten. The first is the tendency to overlook that the reasons for an argument are not the only ones. The second is the tendency to overlook value assumptions, and the third is the tendency to overlook descriptive assumptions. The first aspect, which is relatively easy to overlook, is that besides an argument and its supporting evidence, there may be other reasons for the argument. That is to say, the answer given by the author is not necessarily the real answer, or at least not the only answer. For example, someone tells you, "This Mr. Wang is really amazing. You see, he's a physical education teacher, and ever since he came to our university, our team's performance has improved significantly. So Mr. Wang is excellent, very capable." When you listen to this argument, it seems there's no problem. Mr. Wang is excellent because after he arrived at the school team's performance changed. Actually, this is just one possible interpretation of this argument. It's also possible that Mr. Wang's timing was just a coincidence. Maybe right when Mr. Wang arrived, the university's budget for the team increased dramatically, doubling, so the team had more money to enhance training. Isn't that another possible reason? So you see, the points the author didn't state are also important. There are many similar situations. For example, you have depression, and the doctor recommends a new treatment method, the sunlight therapy, because experts have found that in winter, as the days get shorter, people feel depressed. This is called seasonal affective disorder, and it can be cured with sunlight therapy. Experts have proven through experiments that out of 9 patients with winter depression who were given extra light exposure before they slept and before the sunset, 3 extra hours each time within a week, 7 of the 9 patients had fully recovered, and the other 2 also reported that their symptoms had been alleviated. So this light therapy works by using the body's rhythm to think it's summer, to think there's a lot of sunlight, thereby readjusting the mood. So we also recommend you try this sunlight therapy. If you were the family member of this depressed patient, would you be very willing to try this method that sounds very scientific and has been practically verified? But learning critical thinking requires asking questions. Is this really the only reason these patients were cured? Are there other possible reasons? For example, the patients themselves hope to get better, so this expectation made them subjectively feel better after receiving treatment. That's the placebo effect. Also, it's possible that the patients knew the purpose of the light therapy, and to please the experts or to get the benefits of the study, they told them they had improved even if they hadn't. Another possibility is that during the week of treatment, perhaps the weather was particularly good, and this change in environment made them feel better because they had more time for outdoor activities, and so on. So, in this study, there are many possible reasons that could lead to the same result. Because the sample size was too small, only 9 people with a 1-week validation period, and the entire research process, methods, and conclusions were all vague. This is actually a very flawed argument. If you know to ask such questions, it might lead to other explanations for the patient's recovery, and then your confidence in this conclusion might not be so strong. Therefore, in learning critical thinking, the first thing you need to prevent is neglecting to think about the reasons others haven't told you. You must actively think about what those reasons might be in order to study whether the other party's argument is reasonable. On the other hand, something easy to overlook is value assumptions. In fact, a complete argument is not just conclusion plus reasons, but conclusion plus reasons plus your value assumptions. What are value assumptions? Value assumptions are things we believe are so natural and right that they don't need to be stated explicitly. Let's take smoking as an example again. Someone wrote an article saying that the government should ban the production and sale of cigarettes because there is increasing evidence that smoking not only harms the smoker's own health, but also the health of those present. Do you think there is a problem with this argument? At first glance, the reason for this argument supports the conclusion. But have you noticed that there is a big hidden premise in the entire argument, which is that the author believes that when individual interests are harmed, the collective or the government should step in and take responsibility. This is a value assumption. You might believe that protecting our own interests is our own choice, and we decide for ourselves whether to buy cigarettes, and we don't need you to decide for us whether to buy cigarettes. If you hold the latter view, you lean more towards libertarian ideas. You might, even if you agree with his reason, that smoking may affect one's own health and also harm others' health, disagree with his conclusion that the government should ban the production and sale of cigarettes. You might prefer to hear a conclusion like, give smokers clear warnings in a more reasonable way, let them choose for themselves whether to harm themselves, but just restrict them from harming others. But on what grounds do you not allow people to produce them? You see, this example is one where the reason and conclusion are fine, but it hides a difference in value assumptions, which greatly affects the argument, and thus leads to a huge difference in the acceptance of the conclusion. In fact, we have many similar value assumptions in our daily lives. For example, there is a view that for most of us, going to college is both a waste of time and money, and we have no need to go to school at all. He says, look, first, if you go to college for the opportunity to earn more money, you already have that opportunity without going to college. Studies show that among people with an annual income of over $35,000, more than half do not have a college degree. Second, what you learn in college is rarely applicable to your actual work. So while you are in college, those who didn't go are already starting to earn money. Why should you go to college? If you hear this argument, you might feel that its conclusion and reasons are accurate and supportive. But you need to know that behind this entire argument, there is still a value assumption. This value assumption is that acquiring money or material success is more important than acquiring wisdom. And in this process, the author making this argument is talking about the impact of college education on future income, believing that college has no other purpose than making money. So, if you are someone who believes that wisdom is more valuable than money, you might resist this reasoning. Of course, you can still question the evidence he used, the conclusion he drew, and whether there are other possible reasons in the entire reasoning process. When you learn to ask questions about this argument and add questions about its value assumptions, you have started to think critically. You will know whether to believe others' opinions because you have a method. Finally, there is another type of content often unseen in arguments, which is descriptive assumptions. We talked about value assumptions earlier. A value assumption is about how we think the world should be. which I feel is unnecessary to state because that's just how the world is. A descriptive assumption, on the other hand, is when, in the process of my argument, I feel that some reasons are self-evident and probably don't need to be stated. This might sound a bit abstract, so let's take an example. Suppose someone tells you, "Oh, after you go to that school, you will learn a lot from Professor Wang because his students all praise his lectures as being excellent." You see, can you find what kind of assumption exists in this argument? Let's analyze his argument process. His conclusion is that you will learn a lot from Professor Wang, and the reason he gives is that his students all think his lectures are great. A careful analysis will reveal that this argument process is actually very insufficient. Why can we deduce that you will be able to learn a lot from Professor Wang just because his lectures are great? For this argument to sound reasonable, there must be some unspoken views held by the person who said this. For example, the view that whether you can learn something well is importantly judged by how good the teacher's lecture is. If you believe that a good lecture is an important evaluation criterion for learning something well, then this argument makes sense. Or perhaps you might think that learning a lot means gaining information from a good lecture. In that case, the argument is somewhat plausible. In any case, if you want to understand whether his argument process is reasonable, you must be given some assumptions. For example, this case requires the assumption that good lectures and learning a lot are closely related. When you discover these assumptions that the author should have stated but didn't, those are the questions for you to ask. You can then further ask the person who proposed this view whether a good lecture can really represent learning a lot. Through such a process of rethinking, you will be more rational in judging whether to accept the view that Professor Wang is a good teacher. The content above is some of the core content that the book, Asking the Right Questions, wants to tell us. Some people, after listening, might feel, isn't this critical thinking all about finding fault with others, being picky, or a bit nitpicky? In fact, the thinking process does need to be rigorous. Without being rigorous, it's hard to discover whether a conclusion and argument are reasonable. However, when we communicate and interact with others, having a critical thinking process can actually make the exchange more efficient and allow us to truly focus on discussing the key issues. Moreover, learning critical thinking is not for picking at others' flaws. Applying critical thinking is not just about evaluating others' views, but more importantly, about evaluating our own views and beliefs, to make our own opinions and thinking more and more mature. So, understanding this point, you will know that no matter whose views or methods you listen to, you should adopt an attitude of inquiry and exploration. Perhaps the Chinese translation of criticize as paipa easily makes us associate it with criticism. But in fact, for a period in Hong Kong, it was translated as jiema hauk, ming bian xie sui, or discerning thinking, perhaps to better emphasize the search for a more reasonable explanation or argument process. So, having learned this, when we look at subscription articles again, it's not just about recording what the authors say, but more importantly, about questioning the arguments presented. Because everyone's viewpoint is potentially questionable, or rather, definitely questionable. First, for a program like this, time is limited, so there will certainly be things not thoroughly explained. Second, everyone is prone to incomplete reasoning, as we said before. Our brain's entire reasoning process is involuntary, and these biases and flaws will appear. So, the same applies to the authors on this platform, to the authors of every media outlet, and even to the authors of textbooks. What's important is that you yourself have the ability to ask questions and explore. That is true growth. So what we focus on is not who proposed the view or who said it, but rather the key is whether it is a good view. And the true value of critical thinking is that it gives us the ability to refute a viewpoint, and only then can we truly understand a viewpoint. On this point, I really like something Charlie Munger once said. He said, "I'm not entitled to have an opinion unless I can state the arguments against my position better than the people who are in opposition." In other words, any viewpoint or argument has its constraints or preconditions. Only when we understand more profoundly, when our viewpoint might not actually work, can we truly understand and master a viewpoint. This is true wisdom. Finally, let's summarize our content for today. From the book, Asking the Right Questions, we shared 3 points. First, learn to ask questions. In an information-overloaded world, when all sorts of people are telling you to do A, to do B, and A and B are even opposing opinions, How do we make our own decisions and judgments among these different opinions? This is the first point, and it's important for everyone. Second, the process of learning critical thinking is actually the process of learning to question an argument, which includes questioning the conclusion as well as the evidence. And the tool to master this is to use a checklist to continuously question and train on different issues. Finally, we must not only raise opinions, suggestions, and questions about the problems and viewpoints we can see, but also about the unseen other possible causes, the unstated reasons, those value assumptions and descriptive assumptions that the author considers self-evident. We must analyze them all to form a complete questioning of the argument process. And this entire process is critical thinking. It is the process of constructing a more reasonable inference, making the whole thought process more solid, so that our beliefs and understanding of the world can effectively guide our lives and prevent us from being led into pitfalls by others.